Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com.
Welcome to PCN's coverage of the 2022 election. I'm John Colt. This fall, PCN is visiting 5 colleges from across the Commonwealth to conduct panels highlighting the upcoming election. Today, we're at Robert Morris University and we'll discuss the issues most important to voters for the upcoming election and delve into some key races in Pennsylvania. Joining me for this discussion are Ashley Klingensmith, State Director of Americans for Prosperity, PA, and Justin DePlato, Associate Professor of Political Science at Robert Morris University. We're also joined by a classroom of students from Robert Morris University. For those in attendance wishing to participate, feel free to step up to the microphone with your comments or questions during the program. Justin, I would like to start with you. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump have both made appearances in Pennsylvania in recent weeks, which certainly shows the importance of the state in the upcoming election. What makes Pennsylvania a battleground state?
Well, if we look just at the partisan composition, it's pretty close between Democrats and Republicans. Maybe leaning slightly Democratic now, but obviously Biden, being the president, has significant impact on voters' opinions and decisions, so coming to Pennsylvania makes a lot of sense. There's not a lot of migration to the state, so it's a pretty static population. And then you have, of course, the so-called infamous MAGA Republicans that are pretty dominant in Pennsylvania, so it makes sense for Trump to appear here. I don't like the term battleground states. I think all the states are important, but I think that's the general reason. It's a pretty closely partisanly divided state.
Ashley, same question to you. What makes Pennsylvania a battleground state?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Number one, the last time, Senator Toomey was up for re-election in 2016, you saw a margin that was just under 90,000 voters. So in a state of 13 million, that is quite a narrow margin. So I think there is a fight for every single vote across all 67 counties. And I think the really unique thing about this cycle in Pennsylvania is that we have 2 open top of the ticket races. So that has not been the case since, I believe, 1958, where we have both an open gubernatorial and open U.S. Senate seat. And so I just think, voters are being inundated with television, with things in their mailbox, and certainly with digital in their feed across multiple, social media channels. And so I just think people's antennas are up, and so certainly the president wants to capture that attention.
And before we jump into the statewide contest coming up this fall, I wanted to specifically talk about this region of the state in Western Pennsylvania, since we are here at Robert Morris University today. It seems as though Western Pennsylvania seems to play a pretty important role in a lot of these statewide contests. Can you talk about what makes this region of the state unique? Justin, I would like to start with you with that one.
It's a pretty good composite of what Pennsylvania is, I think, southwestern Pennsylvania. So you have in the city is predominantly dominated by the Democrats, and then the more ex-urban areas are predominantly dominated by the Republicans. And so I think it's just a really good composite of what the state looks like in between Philadelphia and the city of Pittsburgh. Yeah, I'd say it's a good representation of what we see across the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo that, and I'd also just add, you see some of the, nearby counties like Westmoreland and Fayette taking sharp turns just in a decade, where, when I moved, I know, to the Greensburg region just 10 years ago, the courthouse was largely controlled by Democrats, and now it is total sweep of Republicans. And so I think some of those changes have often, have also contributed to the attention that the Southwest is getting.
Justin, can you talk about some of those trends you're seeing in Western PA as well?
Well, where I live in Mount Lebanon, we have 9 school board directors that are all Democrat, which about 20 years ago were all Republican. The commission, which is 5 commissioners, is now all Democrat. Again, 20 years ago, it was mostly Republican. So we're seeing, what's interesting is suburban vote in the area around Pittsburgh becoming more Democratic, and then as you move to what is so-called the rural or the ex-urban vote, becoming intensely more Republican. Like Ashley said, Westmoreland and Fayette becoming more Republican. Even north, Armstrong, Butler, and Beaver becoming more Republican. So it's a pretty good composite, I think, of what's happening nationally, where the urban, suburban areas are leaning Democrat, the ex-urban, rural areas are becoming intensely more Republican. So that's why I think when Fetterman comes here, he goes to the city of Pittsburgh. When Oz comes here, he goes somewhere in Beaver,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Ashley, since you're the state director of Americans for Prosperity Pennsylvania, you go around the whole Commonwealth. Are you seeing these similar trends beyond Western PA as well?
Yeah, I will say, Americans for Prosperity Action, our political action committee that engages in federal elections, has endorsed Oz for U.S. Senate. And so we are knocking hundreds of thousands of doors across all 67 counties. And so we're not just focusing on, what all of the prognosticators say decide elections. We're not just in Bucks County. We're not just in Pittsburgh or the collar counties generally or up in Erie. We're everywhere. And I'll tell you that there seems to be more than ever a hunger for people to be heard. So where we typically would maybe spend a maximum of 4 minutes on a doorstep, people are offering us, water or tea and want to talk a lot. So there is definitely a willingness, I think, this cycle more than I've seen in the past, for folks to want to talk about the issues. And so for us, that's really encouraging because I think people are focused on the right things.
Looks like we have a question from a student. Go right ahead.
Hi, Zoe Moore. Earlier you said that you experienced a narrow margin in voters in previous years. Since this is a bigger election and we have 2 of the bigger seats open in PA, do you expect the margin to be bigger, or how much bigger do you think it will be?
It's a great question. One of the, I think, outstanding notes about the primary on May 17th was that for the first time, I think this century, you saw more Republicans go out to vote than you did Democrats in Pennsylvania. And so I think that, that enthusiasm is something that pollsters are trying to get their thumb on the pulse of, or finger on the pulse of, but I will say I think turnout is going to be pretty big, and I think that's for a number of reasons, but largely because you have candidates that are really working the grassroots, and they are not relegated to their campaign office or just doing, pressers in front of a step and repeat. They're doing pressers in, restaurants and at county fairs, and I think that's maybe one of the really unique things about this race that's going to make people that have actually shook their hand want to go out and weigh in on November 8th.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, and just add that when the race originally started, I thought both Shapiro and Fetterman would win pretty significantly, but I think the races are narrowing, and so I do think they're going to be pretty close, and I do think the issue of abortion will become a pretty central issue within the state, within the campaigns themselves, which will narrow what was a significant Republican advantage going into this election cycle. So I do think it'll be a close election.
Thank you.
To piggyback off that point, what races are voters most interested in this fall? Because again, we do have 2 statewide contests coming up.
Mm-hmm.
I'll start with you, Justin.
Well, I think they're highly interested in the both the Senate race and the gubernatorial race, and then of course their congressional races. Again, they're open seat, the Senate and the gubernatorial races, so that always creates a little more interest in the particular race.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not too privy on the statewide races other than those that I already mentioned, so maybe Ashley can say something to those races.
Yeah, we have 15 state engagements for the General Assembly that span both the House and Senate. And the last thing I read, which was in April, was there are 37 individuals of our General Assembly of 253 that are retiring. And so there is going to be some significant turnover. And I think, the margin in the PA House right now is 113 to 90, in the Senate 28 to 21 with 1 independent, and so those are going to matter. And so we know that just from canvassing in some of the state legislative districts that people already know the candidates' names, which is pretty encouraging. Again, another sign that people are really tuned in and excited about the opportunity to make their voice heard.
And of course, again, there's statewide races, there's congressional races, there's also races for, like you said, the state legislature.
Yes.
But one thing certainly that is in common, that all these issues tie in with one another, even if they're different offices. So let's talk about, I guess, first with the inflation and the economy. I want to start with you, Justin. What have you heard from voters about that particular topic thus far?
Well, typically that would be the number one issue. And I think here in Pennsylvania it is the number one issue. Which typically would hurt significantly the in-party candidates. Ironically, though, we're seeing Shapiro and Fetterman ahead in the polls, so it kind of begs the question, why aren't voters attaching more blame to the Democrats running in their particular races for the rising inflation and costs in general? And then I think you have to pay attention to some more localized issues like, coal jobs, steel jobs, oil pipeline jobs, things like natural gas, which is critical to Pennsylvania voters. But I think we do have a weird phenomenon happening where the Democrats nationally are being blamed for the economy, but in this particular case in Pennsylvania, I think voters are somehow giving them a different take for that, apparently. Maybe because of the extremity of Mastriano and Oz as candidates is something to do with that, I would maybe suggest.
Ashley, why do you think that is the case currently, that both Josh Shapiro and John Fetterman are leading in the polls, and even though with the current state of the economy, like Justin was saying, Democrats are ahead?
Well, I'll say, first of all, it is September. It is just a couple of days after Labor Day. And so there are 60 days to go, and there is going to be a lot of, I think, changes and differences of opinions and more developed or refined opinions as we march toward November. But I will say the very first question we're asking at the door of the cross-section of voters we're meeting is, what is impacting your family the most of the following 4 issues? Gas prices, grocery prices, energy bills, or supply chain issues. And if I had a penny for everyone that said, am I able to say all of the above? I'd be a rich lady. And so we hear that all the time. And so I think, perhaps for a number of reasons, some of that is not being reflected in polling yet. But the bottom line is, over the summer, most people are more concerned about getting in their pool time and vacations and just enjoying that fellowship with friends and family in the neighborhood versus worrying about politics. And so now I think they'll be doing more of that.
Yeah, and I would just add, one of Fetterman's earliest commercials, he is running against Washington. So he's essentially blaming Washington, which implicitly is Biden himself, for all of these problems we just mentioned. So he's trying to position himself as an outsider, someone who can change these problems. And so again, it just behooves me to think that voters are not connecting the dots and realizing that he's a Democrat. He should be held somewhat responsible for these substantial issues that the country is facing. But they're not so far, at least according to the polling, they're not holding him accountable for those issues.
Yeah, and I will say on MSNBC, Mr. Fetterman said he'd like to see federal spending go bigger. And so we are definitely connecting that at the door with voters.
Looks we have another question from a student. Go right ahead.
So back to the matter of the extremism of Mastriano and Oz, do you think their relatively extremist views, especially on matters of abortion, are scaring away potentially moderate or bipartisan voters from going Republican?
Oh, I absolutely think so, yes. I think especially Mastriano, who's on tape saying some rather extreme positions for the 21st century regarding reproductive rights, that's going to be a caveat and a problem for him going forward. Abortion's a real substantive issue that could trump what is the state of the economy issues, and so I think we'll see both Democratic campaigns hit that issue over and over again.
I would say I don't have a good read because we don't work on those kind of cultural, social bucket issues, if you will, at Americans for Prosperity. But I can say, of the literally thousands of doors I've knocked, that has come up one time, and it was in Allegheny County, coincidentally. But for working and navigating through our script that we're working through, people aren't raising that, which might be surprising, but they're not. So.
To stay on the topic of abortion, since the Dobbs decision, it certainly has changed the landscape, I think, in the discussion of the 2022 election. Do we expect this particular topic to play a bigger role in certain regions of the state, whether it's city, suburban, rural? Justin, I'd like to start with you.
Well, I think certainly it'll energize the Democratic base. So the city vote, I think, will be substantially higher as a result. And I think among urban female voters, it'll have a significant effect as well, which, looking back at 2020, looking back at 2018, those were really the pitfalls for the Republican Party. So I would say those are the areas where you're going to see potentially higher turnout if this issue of abortion is as salient as I think it is, which maybe it's not, or maybe people are just concealing it at this point. But looking at what happened in Kansas, where they tried to outlaw abortions and had it on the ballot as a referendum, and then they had huge turnout, and they voted down the initiative. So I think the issue has to be taken seriously, and I think it's one certainly difficult problem for Republican candidates going into the election.
Ashley, even though your organization, again, is not directly involved with that particular topic, what are you hearing from voters, though, on it specifically?
Yeah, I would just say my thought about it is we have yet to see what the full investment from groups like Planned Parenthood Action, Planned Parenthood Votes, Faith and Freedom Coalition, what that full investment is going to be. I suspect there's going to be some more groups where that is their singular focus, sort of doubling down in these final 60 days. But like I said, I have personally knocked on thousands of doors since we commenced our political efforts in April, and I have heard one person bring it up to me. So it might be something that's on their hearts and minds, but they're not opening up to us. They just want to talk about, the ability to have to make trade-offs every single week about gas and groceries and kind of what that looks like for their family.
Looks like we have another question. Go ahead.
Sticking to the question of abortion, it's barely 2 months from Election Day. Do you think that for both candidates, Mastriano and Oz, it's more important to stick to their grassroots voters and stay hard on such topics? Or should they backtrack and try to capture more of the vote that they seem to be losing in polls?
Well, I think at this point they're stuck because they're on the record saying what they said. Now, they could potentially try to backtrack, but I think that would be substantially detrimental as well, because then they're flip-flopping on a particular issue. So my strategic advice to them would be to try to ignore the issue as much as possible, to downplay it, because I don't think it's a popular position within the state among more centrist, moderate voters. But, the cat's out of the bag on that one.
Yeah, and I would just say, for them, I just think focusing on the economy is what is going to be most advantageous, because everyone, no matter if the issue of life or choice is paramount to you, we all are having shared struggle when we're just trying to kind of make ends meet. And so that seems to be the common thread, particularly with that swath of folks in the middle that really do vote on the issues. So I think for everyone, making the economy the issue is probably the most strategic. But great question.
Thank you.
If the economy currently is the biggest topic for Republicans, Justin, do you think it's also the number one issue for Democrats right now?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that that's front and center. It typically is in any election cycle. The number one issue is economy and jobs. And so when you couple that with, staggering inflation, 9% year over year, there's no way a voter can't be aware of that particular issue. It should be the reason why Republicans do well in the fall. But we are seeing the polls narrowing. We are seeing the number of seats that were leaning Republican narrowing. So it does seem like there's something else within the electorate that's making it think twice. And I suspect it's that cultural, social issue of reproductive rights. I mean, women make up a majority of voters in the electorate, You certainly don't want to make them mad, and I think they're concerned very much about the economy. I think there's no question about that. But they also might be rather mad over reproductive rights and what potentially is happening to that for them. Because Mastriano's position is pretty clear. He wants to outlaw abortion. So if I'm, a center-right, center-left voter who has a moderate position on that particular issue, which way do you vote?
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah. And I mean, this is not to, skirt the question, but I think you're really going to have to wait until exit polls to see what really did, tilt someone one way or the other. And I mean, conventional wisdom says that the issue of life or choice it only impacts as the top issue a minority of voters, but there also hasn't been a decision of this magnitude for quite a while. And so there's been people fighting for decades on both sides of this conversation. And so you see as much jubilation as you do, I think fear and uncertainty. So I think, we're just going to have to wait to look at exit polls.
Ashley, you talked about knocking on doors throughout the state, and again, the economy being one of those big issues. So
Yes.
What is the Republican selling point on the topic then? What is the message they are sharing to voters about that particular topic?
Yeah, well, Dr. DePlato talked about that, record high inflation, and that is costing the average household nearly $500 extra a month. And so when we're at doors, we're talking to folks about what that means. And we're sharing with them like the why, because there are a lot of people that have mixed opinions or just total a complete lack of clarity about what is causing inflation. And so we're talking about the record Washington spending that has been happening for several years, and we're saying unless we have someone that is going to commit to stopping the spending spree, we're going to see this continue. There's nothing, doubling down on what DC has been doing is not going to serve any of us well when it comes to our pocketbooks. And so we're kind of focusing on that. And then we're also just talking about, the regulatory barriers at both the federal and state level, frankly, that are keeping folks from kind of maybe innovating their business and changing it post-COVID, and just trying to talk about the fact that if we can lift some of that or kind of rejig some of that, that we would have a better opportunity to increase Pennsylvania's base of businesses and consequently, employees.
And Justin, again, I know you're looking at this from the lens of a political scientist, but if you were advising the Democrats on the issue of the economy, what would be the message you would tell them to share to the voters?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think the most viable strategy is one to acknowledge that the inflation is happening, but to blame something else for the cause. And I think President Biden is doing that. He tried to blame Putin and the Russian invasion of the Ukraine as the main cause of rising gas prices and so forth. And then he's trying to deflect away from it by saying, well, let's pay attention to Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans and the threat they pose to democracy, which I think is foolish and absurd. But I think we're seeing the playbook in front of us right now, the strategy of the Democrats to try to deflect, to try to suggest alternative hypotheses, almost an alternative reality, if you will. I don't think it'll work because the reality is, perception is reality, and people are struggling to pay very common bills as a result of significant inflation. So it should be a tough election for the Democrats. All variables given, they should be struggling. They should lose significantly in the fall election.
Justin, to stay with you, another topic that has come up in recent months was President Joe Biden announcing his plan for student loan relief. Can you talk a bit about this plan and how it may impact the 2022 election?
Yeah, so this forgives $10,000 or up to $20,000 in student loan debt for people that have acquired debt previous to, I think, June of this year. Obviously, it's a move to try to attract younger voters and to appeal to younger voters. What was the other part of your question?
How do you think it will impact the 2022 election?
I think it'll help increase young turnout, which is always a difficult thing to do. Even though I think consequentially the loan forgiveness is relatively low. I think $10,000 in comparison to most people averaging around $60,000 in student loan debt is fractional. It's not that substantially significant, but nonetheless it is free money. It should have some effect on younger voters, but it could have the counter effect of other people who've paid back their loans who are saying, what about me? And maybe that drives them to the polls to try to vote for people who are opposed to the student loan forgiveness plan. I'm personally in favor of it. College is too expensive, but I don't know if this is the best way of tackling that particular issue. It does nothing to control tuition.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
that's what people should be concerned about. How many times are you going to have loan forgiveness in the future, essentially? Maybe never again, maybe every other year, every 5 years.
Yeah, the person that's now going to be footing the bill might not have even gone to college. And so this seems quite unfair to people that have made a deliberative choice based on perhaps their budget about how they wanted to, navigate life as a young person. And so for us, I think this just doubles down on all the wrong incentives for colleges to continue to increase, tuition. And they know that there is this government guarantor of, their notes being paid back. And so I don't see this doing anything. And I think these kind of short-term gimmicks, you heard some people at the State House in Harrisburg talking about a gas tax holiday. I think most voters see straight through that, and that temporary relief is somewhat, it's just a Band-Aid. And it's not driving at the heart of the issue. And so we're going to be back here every year. And so for us, like, getting government completely out of the student lending business is quite critical. So,
Outside of opposing the policy, though, do Republicans think this is a selling point that they can drive up support for their candidates if they talk about their opposition to this? Ashley?
It's a good question. I will tell you, so I believe it was last Saturday, I was knocking doors in Jeanette, which is a area of Westmoreland County. And one couple whose home I went to, they were self-identified Democrats. And the wife just was kind of like, hey, I'm not really interested in taking the survey, but her husband chatted with me for quite a while and shared that he is going to be voting straight party Republican for the very first time, just based on the student loan decision, which was amazing. I texted our team on our group chat while folks were out and about canvassing, and he said, I worked at one juncture when both of my kids were in college, 3 jobs, and this feels patently wrong. And so, I don't know how many of him there are, but I heard it just the week after the decision, came down. And I think another thing people are kind of sick of in America is, legislating by executive order. The president used the HEROES Act to issue this, these executive actions. And I think Americans are wanting Congress to deal with issues of, the purse. And I think people have grown a little weary of using some of these kind of unrelated acts of Congress to make these really significant decisions that are going to impact taxpayers across all political stripes and certainly, ideologies.
Yeah, I would just add, I do think the constitutionality of the action is very questionable. The HEROES Act was targeted to military people to help with their student loan following the attacks of 9/11, 2001. So this is a very aggressive attempt to try to do something without legislative action, which I don't think is within the prerogative of the executive in this particular case. I think clearly this is targeted at youthful voters, so I was curious if any of our students had any thoughts about this. And those who have paid back their bills are seriously going to be substantially upset about this particular issue. So I think in one way it can work for the Democrats, but on the other hand, it can really backfire based on a person's particular position and status as it pertains to student loans.
Now, not to ask the students if they're in favor or against, but I would like to see a show of hands. Is this at least an issue that makes you more or less likely to vote, perhaps? I guess with this particular decision from Biden, would it make you more likely to vote? Anyone less likely to vote? And of course, indifferent. Okay. So again, it's good to get a gauge of what they're saying as well. Another issue I would say that's it was front and center last election in 2020 out in Western PA specifically, so I wanted to bring it up during our discussion, was fracking. It seemed as though when, at the time, President Donald Trump and then candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden were stumping in Pennsylvania, they seemed to talk about fracking quite a bit. This cycle, at least at this point, I've not heard a ton about it. Justin, can you talk about why you think that is at this current point in time, that fracking does not seem to be front and center, at least at this current juncture of the 2022 election?
Yeah, I think, again, it has to do with the other issues trumping something that typically would be a significant issue if we had less inflation and less economic worry in the country. So the general malaise that people feel regarding their economic status, that's the central issue. That's the key issue. You just want to keep hitting that issue over and over again because it's salient with the voters, like Ashley's seen as she knocks on doors. Fracking, things like education, things like climate change, other social issues have really taken a back seat. I think the latest poll I saw was upwards of 60% of voters are concerned about inflation. So we're talking about 6 out of 10 people are saying that's the number one issue. So what happens then, these other important issues just get lost in the weeds, if you will, in this particular cycle.
Yeah, and there's been some, I think other energy issues, the Keystone Pipeline, the halt of drilling and new leases on federal lands, oil and gas leases. I think some of those issues under the first couple of years of this president have percolated in the press and have certainly been reflected at what we're paying at the pump. And I can share just an anecdote about a national tour that we have been doing at Americans for Prosperity called the True Cost of Washington Tour, where we have done almost 500 stops, most of them at gas stations, where for a 2-hour window of time, we're lowering the price of gas to $2.38 a gallon, which was the price it was the day President Biden assumed office. And we're giving folks, we're kind of paying the difference of their gas bill. And that has been an incredible kind of just grassroots campaign. We had an event, in Lower Burl. That was our first event. And so we kind of saw people from Allegheny County, Armstrong County, Westmoreland all converge, and our event was 11 to 1, and we had folks in line at 8 a.m. to save, maybe $20. And so I think because the gas prices are just so, such an everyday, need for people to kind of, again, either address or make trade-offs about, that has just kind of superseded the conversation that fracking ordinarily would be in.
Looks like we have another question from the class. Go right ahead.
We're seeing gas prices across the country go back down. We're seeing the economy starting to sort of level out. And we're also seeing a variety of other issues, including the FBI's raid of Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence. And among all this, we're seeing Biden's approval rating starting to trickle upwards. So do you think that's enough for is it safe to say that Republicans are starting to slip backwards at this point in time, and a couple more issues of this magnitude could solidify it in November?
I think, given what you said, yes, there is some positive news for the Democrats. But again, perception is reality. Now, us political junkies are paying attention to those important facts, but the average voter is still very concerned about the state of the economy and the conditions of the economy. If you look at the macro picture of the House races, it is true probably about 2 weeks ago there were 223 safe leaning Republican seats, and now it's probably down to about 218. So there has been some movement in favor of the Democrats. But if you look at the number of toss-ups at the macro level, it's probably about 38 seats, of which easily 34 of them are Democrat-held seats. So if you're just playing averages, the Republicans should win back the House and easily should get somewhere in the high 200s, if not 230s, in terms of the number of seats they have after the fall election. So, small victories, I would say, very small victories for the Democratic Party.
Yeah. I'd echo what the doctor said. I don't think I have anything more profound to add.
Thank you.
But great question.
A point that was made in the question that I would actually like to expand upon is President Joe Biden's approval rating has gone up in recent weeks. We will see what it will be like in November, but the question is, at this current time, are Democrats that are running for statewide office, whether it be Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman or Attorney General Josh Shapiro, will they use his, again, current rise in approval to be willing to show up with him at campaign events, or are they going to be more hesitant to do so? I know on Labor Day, President Joe Biden was in Pittsburgh, and I know both Attorney General Shapiro and Lieutenant Governor Fetterman were also present at the parade. Again, at this current time with Biden's approval rising, do you think these Democrats are less hesitant now to be side by side with Biden? Justin, I'd like you to answer that first.
Yeah, I think so. I think there is positive energy, there's positive attitude within the Democratic circles. So I think they will shift their opinion of President Biden. The news has been more positive. There's been legislative successes. There has been the narrowing of gas prices. Inflation seems to be steadying, but not really going down. And so why wouldn't you ask the President of the United States to come to a speech? I mean, he's the President of the United States. He's going to attract a milieu of voters. I certainly would do so, and I think Democrats will be more encouraged to do so given the less difficult landscape they faced a couple of weeks or a month ago.
I agree. I think you'll probably see the president visit Pennsylvania a couple more times before November, and folks join him. I think, just as Dr. DePlato said, anytime you can appear with a sitting president, it's probably pretty good for press. It's probably pretty good for the people that ordinarily would sit out a midterm, which is a lot of voters. There are many, many people who say, I go to the polls every 4 years when the president is on the ballot. One of my friends says that, and I'm working very hard to change her opinion. But yeah, and so I think that is helpful too, if we're really focusing on turnout, and that is the name of the game in a Commonwealth like Pennsylvania, where there are so many people that remain undecided. It's cliche, but it comes down to who shows up on November 8th and who actually returns those mail-in ballots and, of course, requests them in the first place. But yeah, I think you'll see the president visiting a few more times.
Do you think former President Donald Trump, who recently had a rally in Northeast PA to boost the candidacies of State Senator Doug Mastriano and Dr. Mehmet Oz, do you think former President Donald Trump will also be making more appearances in the Commonwealth leading up to the 2022 election? And is this a net positive for Republicans, or could this potentially drag down some of those candidates running for statewide office? Ashley, I'd like to direct that one to you first, and then Justin afterwards.
Well, I think, with the Republican base, there was an incredibly contentious primary, both for the U.S. Senate seat and the gubernatorial seat. And so there were just so many strong opinions and divisions within the Republican base that show up every election cycle. And so, I think people can make the argument that the former president might could help with just shoring up some of those folks to show up. But I don't know. I have no inside information on that front. But I think, what is critical for these candidates to continue to do is meet as many Pennsylvanians as they possibly can, because ultimately this is probably, going to come down to under 100,000 votes. if not just the U.S. Senate seat, perhaps the gubernatorial election as well. And so all of those conversations and all of those interactions are going to matter, and people are just so much more likely to have a horse in the race or a stake in the game if they have had some sort of personal interaction beyond just what they're seeing on television or on their, Facebook feed or in their mailbox.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would just add that, Trump is an enormous magnet for his particular followers, and he's endorsed both Mastriano and Oz, so there's a personal vanity dynamic for President Trump to want to stump speech for these particular candidates because he wants them to win so he can continue to prove to everyone that he's the heart and soul of the Republican Party. So I think unequivocally he will be back. I think he'll invest the time and energy to try to get these two to win. Will it work? If he gets indicted, then maybe he becomes a liability. We'll see.
Yeah, and I just add, congressional approval is at this all-time low. Washington is just very unpopular generally right now. People are so cynical about the folks that are there. And so, both Oz and Fetterman have not had tenures in D.C., and so I think continuing to kind of separate yourself from that arena is smart because people don't like what's happening there. They think it's highly dysfunctional, and so trying to double down on like the outsider narrative, I think is probably wise for both of them.
Looks like we have another question from the class. Go right ahead.
Hi. So do you guys think we're going to be seeing more of an in-person voter turnout this year, since in the 2020 election, mail-in ballots and voter security kind of got shook up in the presidential election? Do we think now, since COVID's kind of passed, do we think we're going to be seeing an even amount? And if people do mail-in ballots, that there will be questions on voter security with that? Or do we think we're going to be seeing just in general more of an in-person voter turnout?
Well, personally, I hope we have more in-person voting. I do think the convenience of mail-in voting will continue. It will continue to favor the Democrats. Republicans will favor the in-person voting. But I think we'll see a significant number of mail-in voting because of the convenience of it.
I do too. I know a number of people just in my personal orbit who never used mail-in voting, and they have the past couple of elections, even municipal level. And so, yeah, I think it's here to stay, and I think that it is up to parties and campaigns to do a really good job of that chasing with people that have requested them and making sure they're returning them. And I do agree that there will probably be bigger turnout in person day of, just because COVID is somewhat in the rearview mirror to a degree. But I do think we're going to have a lot of folks continuing to just take advantage of that option now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually would like to stay on that topic, something I wanted to get to today as well. Ashley, as you're talking to voters at their doorsteps, we know Republicans, I guess, generally speaking, have been a little more hesitant to vote by mail, but when you're talking to voters at their doors, are you hearing that they want to vote by mail, or are you also, as your group, encouraging them to vote by mail as well?
So we're not favoring either option. We're saying that faith and trust in the process is paramount, and we want people to have total confidence that their vote matters. And so we haven't taken any kind of stance on what method we prefer. What we want is for people to vote, period. And the more people that are engaged in the conversation, the better health our nation is in overall. But I have not talked with a lot of people that have volunteered that they are going to vote by mail. So, and I think the default is going to the polls still in Pennsylvania, especially given that we don't have early voting, what you see in some other big Senate states this year. So So yeah, I mean, I will say the fact that we do have such an uptick in mail-in voting means that the next few weeks for these candidates are so much more important than maybe they were a few years ago. Because as people start to get those applications and mail them in, if there is some huge, issue that comes up in the final few weeks, you can't change your vote. And so I think it's going to be really important for these guys to capture, it is all guys, yes, these four gentlemen at the top of the ticket to capture people's attention in a big way over the next 3 weeks.
Justin, do you think Republicans would benefit from embracing vote by mail?
I think so. Given the demographics of the Republican Party, a lot more older voters, so it makes sense that ease of voting would be beneficial. But there are generally more Democrats in the electorate than Republicans, so if we just think in terms of partisan voting, if you increase turnout, you are increasing the odds of the Democrats succeeding in the election. So I think that's why Republicans are somewhat counter mail-in voting, because they want to suppress the vote a little bit because they don't have the numbers per se. So I guess in a way it would be beneficial, but I could see it not being if there's that significant partisan composition.
In an earlier response Ashley had, you talked about knowing specifically a voter that they vote only when the president's on the ballot. I know you are working very hard to change their mind, but either way, again, I think at large people typically don't vote in these midterms as they do in these presidential election years. How would this compare 2022 in comparison to 2018, the last time we had a midterm election in Pennsylvania, and will voter turnout be significantly different in 2022 in comparison to 2018? Justin, I'd like to start with you.
Oh boy, I suspect that the turnout will be slightly lower. However, if I think about it, I'm not sure if I could justify that answer. Predicting turnout is a madman's science. It's no really good way of doing it. Again, with convenience of voting, that should encourage turnout. The saliency of the issues should encourage turnout. The quality of the candidates should encourage turnout. But they also have this general malaise that people are fed up with Washington and really discouraged with modern politics, and that cynicism is really strong, so that should discourage turnout. So I would wager it'll be more along the average line. I don't think it'll be significantly higher. I don't think it'll be significantly lower. I think more of what we've seen in the past in terms of an average turnout is probably more expected, in my opinion.
I think maybe considering, I believe Congress right now is 219 in the Democrat majority to 211 with 5 vacancies. And then, of course, the U.S. Senate is tied. And I think maybe because of those incredibly close margins, that could be, a factor that tips the scales in favor of someone turning out. Because they know that really, this congressional seat might make the balance of power, their preference or not. And so, and certainly that applies for the U.S. Senate seat here in Pennsylvania. I think a lot of people are talking about, pickups here or there, but if you don't retain, North Carolina and Pennsylvania, the pickups become a little less relevant. And so I think that folks do want a check. We hear that a lot. It's not said in maybe that way, but there is, single party control right now in Washington, and there's not a lot of challenge happening in the chambers. And so I think people want that. I think people want healthy debate, and I'm not sure that's necessarily been happening over the past couple of years. So I think turnout's going to be, I'm going to go on the other side. I think it's going to be a little higher.
To follow up on that question, are there specific regions in the state you believe may have higher turnout and some regions may have lower in comparison to the previous midterm? Justin, I will once again start with you.
Originally, I would have said the cities probably would have lower turnout, but now with the issue of abortion being potentially on the minds of the voters, it could help encourage city Democrat voters to participate. I would expect the turnout to be significant in the suburban areas. That's really the battleground for the races. And like Ashley said, if people are really concerned about the balance of power, about sort of the dynamics of Washington and whether or not their vote is going to have significance, then maybe they do participate at a higher level. But clearly the suburban, exurban areas, I think, are the most important to pay attention to.
I agree with that. And I think, maybe folks that have typically not been engaged, but engaged with one of these candidates, in the primary, feel a particular need to get out again, whether it's to have a protest vote or not. So I think he's right. I mean, of course, the collar counties of Philadelphia and Allegheny County, but I think you should watch out for Erie, and I think that the Northeast is going to. There's a lot of state ledge seats up there that are in play, and so there's going to be a big investment there, I think, from the party and from candidates and from outside groups. And so I think that's going to drive up maybe numbers that the Northeast hasn't seen. They have a very competitive congressional race up there, the Matt Cartwright seat. And so, because it was redistricted and it looks a bit different this cycle. So I think for all of those reasons, those are maybe two areas to kind of keep a lookout for.
Looks like we have another question from the class. Go
Yeah,
right
I just
ahead.
wanted to talk about the various policies that each candidate is advocating for. Excuse me. Particularly with Fetterman, I'm just curious as to what you may have heard, like knocking on doors. He's trying to get innocent people out of prison, which is absolutely reasonable. But I'm just curious as to what you may have heard regarding that policy or Fetterman in general. He certainly seems more appealing to the people. Like when you see him, he's not in a suit and tie. He's trying to advocate for the people. I'm just curious as to what you may have heard.
I can tell you crime is another issue that obviously both campaigns are trying to double down on in their own, from their own perspectives. But it is not something that people bring up at the doors to us, similar to the life choice, Dobbs decision. They're just not bringing that up. And we have a employee in Philadelphia, and that is not necessarily something that is a regular thing people want to bring up outside of the boundaries that we're talking about in our survey, which is the economy and energy principally, and just the size and scope of Washington generally. So there's obviously both of these campaigns are making crime an issue, but we're frankly not hearing that at the doors so much when we're talking with the cross section that we're kind of targeting.
Yeah, and that was brought up by the Oz campaign, if I remember correctly, the issue of Fetterman's position on criminality. So right now, what we're witnessing is really a campaign that's run through the airwaves, as opposed to a campaign that's run through debates, because Fetterman hasn't accepted a debate yet. I think he might have now. But once we have a debate, then we'll get more clarity on where they stand on the issues. Right now, as a person who follows politics, I'm somewhat unclear because we're just getting the airwave messaging, and you can't necessarily trust that per se. So, yeah.
So how do you feel there's more people on the fence, or are they leaning one way or another recently?
So the voters that we're talking with are definitely wanting to talk about the issues. There's a lot of people that are still undecided, and they want to cut through the noise of the personalities, and that is what has been the focus of so many ads, at least in this media market, and I'm in Harrisburg regularly in the central PA region. It is so heavy on the personality thing, and people really look, maybe the base of both parties gets, excited by that. But I think the people that are going to decide this election, who actually genuinely vote on policy, are still trying to wade their way through, which is why at Americans for Prosperity Action, who is engaged in this U.S. Senate election, we have been saying, debates are very important. That is the venue for you to have a unfiltered access to a candidate. Hopefully they're not getting the questions in advance and they're able to be, put on the spot to a degree. And so we are elated that there is now, an opportunity for the people of Pennsylvania to see these guys up on a stage, not with their handlers, but just, being accessible to the people.
Yeah, and I think because Fetterman has held out so long, you're going to see increased interest in this first debate, because I think a lot of people want to know exactly what he's for and what he's about.
Yes.
And there's recent polling suggests about 10% are undecided.
Yes.
So it's really a toss-up.
Yep.
And depending on what people see and hear, that will likely determine the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We just have over 3 minutes left, and I know this may be a difficult question to encapsulate in just a few minutes, but I would like to ask, since again the most important races in the state are statewide races, or the ones that are getting the most attention, I should say, for both of you, what are the perceived strengths and weaknesses for all the candidates in the race? And again, I know just a few minutes, but I guess we'll start with the gubernatorial race. Justin, to start with you, what are the perceived strengths and weaknesses for Attorney General Josh Shapiro and State Senator Doug Mastriano?
Well, I'm a big advocate of saying perception is reality. And I think the perception that people have of Doug Mastriano, unfortunately, is that he's a bit extreme. And I think that paints Shapiro as more of a moderate, more of a centrist. But whether he is or isn't, I think is debatable. And I think his time in office is actually his biggest strength. The Wolf administration has been relatively popular over its 8 years. And Shapiro, I think, is seen as someone who would carry forth the Wolf administration and sort of create stability and steadfast within the Commonwealth. I think in the Fetterman and Oz race, clearly what's hurting Oz is the fact that he's not really a Pennsylvanian. Again, perception is reality, and I think Fetterman has done a very nice job of suggesting that this man is an outsider, he's sort of a charlatan, he's an elite liberal millionaire, for example. And again, we don't have a lot of substantive issue differences, but I think those will come to light. Fetterman's strength, I think, as mentioned by one of our students, he just looks like a common guy, and that plays well in Pennsylvania. This is a common people's common state, blue collar workers and so forth. So I think the perceptions right now really favor Shapiro and Fetterman, but I do think the campaigns are slowly breaking down those perceptions.
Yeah, I just on a kind of looking back to the primary, I think one of the things that is working in Senator Mastriano's favor is that the party has seemed to coalesce behind him, and there really was a question of like how long that might take or to what degree that might might manifest itself. And so there seems to be like a unifying effort to get him across the finish line. And of course, for Attorney General Shapiro, he had that incredible primary support, and so started right out of the gate on May 18th with a lot of momentum from the party. And he's a known commodity statewide. People have already put him in office on a statewide ticket, so he's got that name ID. And then for the Senate race, I would probably say the same thing about the Republican side of the ticket. Mehmet Oz had millions and millions of dollars spent against him in the primary, and so you kind of wondered, oh my goodness, are people going to coalesce? And I think you're seeing that they are. And the polls are reflecting that if you look at trends. And then, as far as Mr. Fetterman goes, again, he's won on a statewide ticket. People know who he is. And he swept with a number of other people on the ballot, some arguably rising stars on the ballot. He swept all 67 counties. And so that is something that really should not be understated, in my opinion.
Well, that's all the time today we have for our election panel at Robert Morris University. Our guests have been Ashley Klingensmith, State Director of Americans for Prosperity, PA, and Justin DePlato, Associate Professor of Political Science at Robert Morris University. Special thanks to Professor DePlato and Robert Morris University for hosting our program, and I'd like to thank the students as well for your participation. Stay with PCN over the next 2 months as we continue to provide coverage of the 2022 general election. I'm John Cole. Thank you for watching.